Story 1. Probably my adult brother working the room for roofing business opportunities at my grandfather's funeral. Story 2. My grandpa fell asleep at his daughter's funeral and was snoring so loudly that everyone started laughing. Then my grandma's phone went off, playing "It's 5 o'clock somewhere" loudly on a small flip phone at a Pentecostal church. Everyone lost it at that point. Story 3. At my great-uncle's funeral, an elderly woman approached my great-aunt and said, "You must miss him terribly." My great-aunt replied, "You know I do." The woman then said, "He was the best kisser I never married." It turns out my great-aunt met her future husband through her friend when her friend and future husband were dating. It was a long-standing joke that they had kissed the same man. Story 4. At my uncle's wake, his son, my cousin, got up on the microphone to talk about his dad and told a Jesus joke. The joke is as follows. Jesus and Moses are walking along the beach when Moses looks out to the water and hums, "What is it?" Jesus asks, "Just wondering if I still have the old mojo." Moses replies, "Well, go on and give it a try," Jesus says. Moses does. He raises his hands and commands the water to part, and it does. "Still got it," he says. They continue walking for a bit before Jesus turns to the water and says, "I wonder if I still have it." Moses tells him to give it a go. Jesus walks out onto the water. He gets about 3 feet out before he starts to sink. He walks back to the shore and says, "I don't get it. Did I lose my mojo?" Moses says, "Of course not. You were just nervous. Get back out there and try again." "You're right," Jesus replies and starts out on the water again. This time he gets about 6 feet out before he starts to sink. He swims back to shore and says, "I just don't get it. I must be out of shape." They continue walking until Moses stops and says to Jesus, "I bet you just need to really concentrate. Connect with your Father." "You're right," Jesus says and starts walking out on the water again. This time he gets 30 feet out before he begins to sink. Moses raises his hands and commands the water to part, and Jesus walks back to the shore. Moses looks at him up and down and says, "Aha, I've got it." He points to Jesus' feet. "You didn't have those holes before." It is not exactly inappropriate, but got a real good laugh out of our big Irish Catholic family. It was a joke that my uncle loved to tell. Thank you for letting me share this piece of love with you all. Story 5. How long until we finally throw her into the pit? I want to watch the game. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce to you my father. He said this at his own mother's funeral 10 minutes after arrival. Story 6. They were looking for her ashes, and I said, "Did you check the ashtray in the living room?" They were not amused. Grandma was a heavy smoker before she passed. Story 7. When my 14-year-old sister cried at her best friend's funeral, my mother told her she needed to control herself. Story 8. It is not inappropriate as such, but it is still funny. My cousin turned up to my grandmother's funeral with a new haircut that he got just before, and he was saying that the barber messed it up. My mum then looked back, nodded at the casket and said, "Ah well, she won't mind." It made me laugh more than I felt comfortable doing at a funeral. Story 9. A Southern Baptist preacher said 2 sentences about the deceased, and then delivered a 20-minute sermon about how everyone in the room needed to get right with Jesus, or they would all be going to hell. It was so bad that the wife uninvited him from attending the burial and had friends and family share stories about her husband at the gravesite. Story 10. The in-laws' Bible-thumping neighbor was a Pentecostal. When another neighbor lady died, the Bible thumper said it was too bad she did not convert before death because she was going to hell now. Story 11. I burst out laughing because my mother's ashes looked like lemon pepper seasoning. I stand by it, but it was pretty inappropriate. Story 12. One of my good friends committed suicide when I was in 6th grade. During his viewing, someone said, "They really messed him up." Looking back, I don't think they meant it as an insult, but more because of how they had him dressed and his hairstyle, which went totally against what he liked. Plus, his parents were poor role models. His dad was a drug addict who left around his 6th birthday, and his mom was an abusive alcoholic who was in and out of his life. After his dad left, She dropped him off at his grandparents'. Everyone who knew him like that was uncomfortable with the fact that they treated him so badly in life but were now acting like they were the best parents ever. What stands out to me, though, is that after he said that so many people wanted to beat him up, it was just because emotions were running high, and when we went back to school, it was resolved. Story 13. My aunt was living with my grandmother when she died and had power of attorney over her. My grandmother was not a religious woman, but my aunt decided to hold a funeral at the Baptist church she attended. The pastor's eulogy was not about my grandmother at all. Instead, he told us that our grandmother was in heaven because she accepted Christ before her death, but that we would all go to hell and never see her again if we did not convert. He asked for people to come forward to convert. No one did, so he asked everyone to shut their eyes and said a prayer trying to convert us on our behalf without our consent. No one shut their eyes. When my father was leaving the funeral, the pastor said to him, "I'm sure we'll see each other again." My father replied, "I doubt it. I didn't go along with the prayer, so apparently I'm going to hell." We rarely talk to that aunt anymore. My sister said she almost got up to make a scene because she was so angry. Story 14. A full Catholic Mass and sermon. My grandmother was not Catholic but had a Catholic funeral because my mother, who was also not Catholic, was dating a Catholic man. Felt rude and disrespectful. Story 15. Not sad but inappropriate all the same. My uncle was a great golfer who played as much as he could. He died from cancer. At the funeral, his grandsons and granddaughter were encouraged to write a message on a golf ball. At the minister's signal, they each dropped the balls into the grave, but 2 balls bounced off the coffin and fell straight out again. My brother then said, 4. Story 16. I did not cry at my grandfather's funeral, and my mother pointed that out while everyone else was crying. I was not that close to him, and I do not recall ever having a conversation with him or knowing anything about him while he was alive. Story 17. Well, now your mother is in hell with your brother, who was gay. Your mom died by suicide. How can people be so cruel? Story 18. My little sibling took a toy from me, so I screamed, "You are dead," before starting to chase him. I got yelled at pretty badly for that. Story 19. Someone stood at the casket, waved their hands in the air, and said loudly, "Wake up!" Unfortunately, it was my child. Story 20. The speaker at my grandmother's funeral was her little cousin. He spoke for about 15 minutes about how beautiful my grandmother was when she was younger and essentially implied that he had always wanted to be with her. This immediately made everyone in the family angry, and he was asked to leave the funeral. Story 21. My 2 grandmothers were friendly rivals. When one died, the other was in the early stages of dementia and occasionally said inappropriate things. The living grandmother received the deceased grandmother's prized fur coat and wore it to the funeral. During a quiet moment in the ceremony, she turned to me and said loudly, "She would die if she knew I was wearing her coat." Many laughs were shared that day. Story 22. More was said outside the funeral, mostly secondhand since I was not even 2 at the time. When my mother died, her sister-in-law said, "I had better things to do. Hate that I got guilt into coming here." This created a rift between my father and his sister that lasted until her death. They never spoke again after that. Story 23. Not so much inappropriate, but more cringy. When I was 19, I went to a friend's funeral. Because I had not been to many and was unfamiliar and uncomfortable with the situation, I accidentally told his father, "Thank you for having me," after he thanked me for coming. I tried to recover and said, "I am sorry for your loss." But it was too late. I am 20 years older now, and it still makes me want to hide in a hole. Story 24. It wasn't at the funeral, but at my grandmother's house after her service. Someone had put sticky notes with their names on them all over her belongings that they wanted. Story 25. Not me. My mom used to own a pub, and she had a booking for a wake to take place after the funeral. During the wake, she was going around collecting the empty glasses and asking the customers if the drinks were finished. The icing on the cake was that we forgot to turn the jukebox off. The free random song that started playing was the Bee Gees' Staying Alive. Story 26. A man placing a baseball cap on my father's head while he is wearing a suit and taking a flip phone selfie. It is the most absurd thing I have ever seen. My daughters and I laugh about it at least once a month. Story 27. Time to drink while walking to the trunk, pulling out a cooler with beer and liquor. This was at the cemetery. Story 28. I would have to say it was a funeral for a coworker. The priest talked about how he was lucky to have attended an expensive all-Catholic school in the area and read something about his job description that sounded like it came from the company brochure. There was very little about him, what a light he was to others, his mental health struggles, or anything hopeful about the son he left behind. Felt miserable. It was as if the priest did not know him at all, did not want to be there, and had not spoken to anyone who knew him. At another funeral that year, a different coworker had been brutally murdered by her live-in ex-partner. The pastor spoke more about forgiveness than about her or why the senseless act did not have to happen. It felt like he sided more with the murderer than the victim. This contributed to the feeling that year that there was no decency left in the world, that you could die, and the person giving the eulogy would be more concerned with finishing quickly than leaving anger at the person responsible. Story 29. At my aunt's funeral in New York City, the priest spoke at the beginning and said my aunt could now fly on Death Airlines and would be accompanied by Superman and Spider-Man. I had to hold one of my uncles back from charging. It did not get better after that. Story 30. A fear of God sermon for a known atheist. Funerals are for the living, no matter how disrespectful it may seem. Story 31. Probably not the worst, but I went to a funeral where the deceased man's wife was talking about how he was a loyal follower of Bristol City Football Club in the United Kingdom, and somebody booed. Story 32. My mother and aunt had a loud argument at my father's funeral, inside the chapel in front of everyone. Story 33. A woman related to the opposite side of the family told the woman whose mother passed away, "See, this is why people need to be better people. God punishes those who are bad," implying she was being punished by losing her mother. Yes. Story 34. More of a UK story. My aunt planned my nan's funeral. I gave the eulogy, and the priest told us that a piece of music would play as I got up to speak and to wait until it was finished before starting. My aunt had chosen an instrumental piece called Albatross. To anyone unfamiliar, this was the music on the Marks and Spencer "This isn't just food. This is Marks and Spencer food" adverts. Someone at the back of the church piped up, "This isn't any funeral, this is academic's Nan's funeral." It took us about 10 minutes to stop laughing, while the priest checked his watch frantically because he had another funeral after us. Story 35. My uncle's wife committed suicide. My very conservative family was sitting silently and somberly at the funeral. You could hear a pin drop. Suddenly, "I Feel Good" by James Brown blasted through the speakers. It made us jump. It was so loud. We were all side-eyeing each other, and my mother was elbowing me because I was shaking so hard, trying not to burst out laughing. Apparently, according to my uncle, it was requested to be played by the deceased. Story 36. I was at my grandmother's funeral. He told the story of how he got let out of Sunday school early and went home. When his mom got home, she thought he had skipped Sunday school and punched him in the face. She apologized after she found out they had been let out early. Each of her children told a story at the funeral. I think every one of them was about how she punished them growing up, from making them march around the yard in their socks and then forcing them to hand wash the socks until they were white again to getting punched in the face. My mom couldn't figure out why I didn't like her parents. Story 37. A friend of mine died by suicide a few years ago. Her family belonged to a very religiously abusive church that covered for her abusive parents throughout her life. She had post-traumatic stress disorder and religious trauma, which heavily contributed to the depression that led to her death. Her siblings still belonged to the church, and they hosted the funeral there. The pastor said that suicide was a mortal sin and advised not to think about where she is now, urging people to pray that other sinners find salvation in her honor. I think about her all the time and remain very angry for her. Her true friends held a memorial at her favorite coffee shop, and we all miss her deeply. Story 38. My grandfather's funeral. All of us were listening to stories we had shared. personal anecdotes about the man and some experiences we had with him. Then they started reading one story about when he was courting our grandmother. It turns out they had gone out one night to the local park and stayed out so late that all the gates were locked when they tried to leave. Of course, all the grandkids, including myself, knew the reason they had been locked in was because the pair of them had been intimate in the park after dark. We were all holding back laughter at the idea of our prim and proper grandparents being teenage rebels. Then the story reached its peak. My grandfather worked for the General Post Office, which later became the UK Royal Mail Post Office and British Telecom. He was an electrical engineer. He happened to bring a set of wire cutters on his date with our grandmother. That broke all of us. We started howling with laughter at the idea of our grandfather and grandmother sneaking over the top of a wrought iron fence covered with barbed wire, which he cut away, so they could escape the judgment of the local police. Miss you both, you lovable rebels. Story 39. My father's funeral. I have an older sister who is a saint. Classic salt of the earth kind of person. She also happens to be best friends with a celebrity who is known worldwide. Not telling who. Complete don't ask. They met in college. The celebrity is also humble and low-key. She often visited my parents quietly in a small town in rural America. She never pulled the "I'm a celebrity" card. Quite the opposite, and we all consider her an adopted sibling. When my dad passed, there was no question that she wanted to be there. She purposefully drove in with a rented Prius to avoid any undue attention by flying into the tiny local airport via her own private jet. Cue my brother, who is schizophrenic and, had he been born in the last 15 years or so, would have been described as being on the autism spectrum regarding social skills and executive functioning. Not shaming, just pointing out that many diagnoses were not part of the 1960s and 1970s. My brother apparently took the celebrity aside and berated her for making the funeral all about her, and how dare she try to upstage us. The celebrity did nothing of the sort and did everything she could to not stand out. She was there to show support and pay respects to a man who was like her own father. She went home in tears and full of apologies. When we confronted my brother, he blamed it on his diagnosis and having been heavily medicated on Valium. But weirdly, he didn't call out my aunt, who really was trying to make it about herself. I didn't buy it then, and it ruined what should have been a beautiful tribute to my dad. The celebrity has never returned to our hometown, and it breaks my heart. Before anyone shames me, I have an autistic son, and he still knows what appropriate behavior is. Story 40. So, do you know what everyone is getting? Asked my first cousin at my grandmother's funeral. Also, no, Jennifer, Grandma's caregiver, has to sit next to Nick, meaning me. This was at the post-funeral luncheon. It wouldn't have been as bad, but she invited my ex of 7 years and said it right in front of her. My mom tried to play Cupid at her mother's funeral with me. Story 41. Grandma promised me the piano. No, she promised me. A scuffle ensued. She had not even been lowered into the ground yet. At the luncheon afterward, brother-in-law went into intimate details with the minister sitting across from him. Story 42. Claiming that the child of the deceased was pretending to be the child of the deceased. It was my partner about me, and it was deeply funny. Wildly inappropriate, but deeply funny. Story 43. It was more rude than inappropriate to me, but when my grandfather on my father's side died, my mother said, "At least I don't have to make pig's feet anymore. First, you never had to begin with, and second, why does someone need to be dead for you to be able to stop cooking something?" He was never a frequent visitor. Story 44. My stepmother wrote the eulogy that my uncle read. She went on for pages, criticizing my sister for her choices. Story 45. It wasn't what was said, but what happened. My husband's parents are divorced and his father remarried. No one liked the new wife, which will become relevant shortly. My husband's paternal grandmother passed away, and his mother asked his father and uncle if it would be okay to pay respects. They agreed because grandma liked her. I'm not sure why, but that is another story. I was 7 months pregnant when we arrived at the funeral home. My sister-in-law was there, along with some cousins, and they were asking about the pregnancy. Someone greeted my husband's mother. Suddenly, My father-in-law's wife came up the aisle screaming that she was not welcome. When my father-in-law and his brother tried to calm her down, she lost control. She started swinging at my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law was hit in the face, and she began screaming at me. She tried pushing my husband and made derogatory comments about why I would want to be pregnant with him, calling me inappropriate names. I was ready to respond, but my husband's cousin stepped in front of me like a protective older brother. He was worried she was going to become physically violent with me. Then my father-in-law went out to the parking lot after her and tried talking with her. She attempted to run him over, then took the dogs and left. We had to go to court, and she showed up in a wheelchair, which was her usual behavior. If she had to attend court, she insisted on showing some ailment, neck brace, cane, or wheelchair. Story 46. Basically, nothing was said to me, which is exactly the embarrassing part. I went to a final farewell for a man who used to often come to the cafe where I worked. I walked into the building, and apparently his closed casket was quite low, near the floor. I have many issues with my eyesight when there are sudden changes in light, and I had absolutely no clue I was already in the room where that man was lying. There were about 3 people standing there whom I assumed were staff members, but they turned out to be his daughters. I walked past them and gave a nod with a modest smile, assuming I had to walk a bit further and turn the corner to reach his casket. Well, I turned the corner and found myself back at the entrance of the building, very confused at first and then quickly, extremely embarrassed when I realized what had just happened. The only things that make me feel a little better are that his daughters have no idea who I am, and I know he probably would have found this situation extremely funny. It has been 2 years, and it still haunts me though. Story 47. The church played "I Will Meet Him in the Garden" as a hymn, which refers to Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane prior to the crucifixion. This was at my uncle's funeral. There is nothing really wrong with that hymn, except for the fact that my uncle died of a sudden heart attack in his garden. His body was found by his wife, who made a truly bereaved wail when she heard it. Story 48. Not everyone is sad to see a family member pass away. For some, it could not happen soon enough, and perhaps rightly so. This was said to me by the funeral director. Story 49. I was sitting next to my grandmother at her nephew's funeral. She was a great person, and it was a sad loss. The funeral home was packed with people standing in the back. After every eulogy, my grandmother clapped once. No one else clapped. Even as a little child, I knew it was inappropriate to clap after a eulogy. I was trying hard not to laugh. It was much worse when I heard my mother say to my uncle, "Someone needs to tell Mom to stop clapping." Thinking back now, I can't help but laugh about this. My grandmother was such a well-meaning person. Story 50. Overheard my uncle talking about how Joseph R. Biden Jr. stole the election. I do not visit that part of my family anymore. Story 51. Not really an inappropriate saying, but a funny story from a wake many years ago. I come from a large family, so after the visitation, there is often a lot of food. Home-cooked, platters from fast food places, everything. At the wake of an elderly distant family member, someone had brought a whole uncarved turkey, as you would serve at Thanksgiving. I am guessing some of the food and drink were delivered beforehand, as everything was arranged in the kitchen by the funeral home staff. My uncle was the first to show up and was in the kitchen area waiting for everyone to arrive. Apparently, he started to help himself to the turkey, but only the white meat portion of the breast, and only the white meat portion. Since it was uncarved, he used those cheap plastic knives to carve and slice, and absolutely mangled the breast. He got his fill and went to the visitation room as everyone started showing up. I arrived sometime later and sat nearby his son, my cousin. As things got started, you could hear the grumblings and whispers throughout the room. "I can't believe someone ruined the turkey. Someone dropped the turkey. Where's the turkey so and so brought?" My cousin swung past the kitchen and saw the funeral staff throwing away a nearly whole turkey minus the mutilated breast. If I remember correctly, enough people complained, and since no one knew what happened to the turkey, they threw it out. The assumption was someone ate it, but since no one fessed up, into the trash it went. Everyone in the building was now aware of the turkey fiasco. I come from a Mexican family, so the family drama started up. I bet it was Tia Nina, she always does this. And drama like that. Flash forward an hour or so. During the services, I glanced over to my cousin and he was shoving his fingers into his eye sockets. I put my hand on his shoulder and said, "I'm sorry. I had no idea you were so close." He stood up abruptly and waved his hand for me to follow him. We went outside and he began to laugh uncontrollably. That deep, delirious laughter. He explained that during the service, my uncle leaned over to him and told him a secret. Understand that my uncle had a very unique voice and laugh. I can't even begin to describe it, but it was sort of like a crackly, high-pitched heh. He leaned over and whispered, "I ate all the white meat," patted his belly. Heh. We both laughed at this point, composed ourselves, and headed back in. My uncle, of course, now needled us and periodically throughout the remainder of the service patted his belly and quietly said, "Heh." Only the three of us knew at that time, and it was one of the funniest, most uncomfortable things in my life, holding in a laugh during an event like that. He passed many years ago, but it is still a family joke now, and not a Thanksgiving or Christmas meal goes by without someone saying, "I ate all the white meat," in imitation of his voice and laugh. I love that man and miss him dearly. Story 52. I guess I'm the guilty one. At a coworker's funeral, there was a huge spray of roses covering her casket, and I said, "Oh man, Diane would have loved this," and got looked at really funny. But she had cancer for several months before she died, and she had said, "There better be lots of flowers at my funeral." I think she would have been satisfied with the amount. Story 53. Not at the funeral, but during the scattering of the ashes. I was in the car with my uncle and my grandfather's ashes, trying to find a parking space so we could walk down to the dock area to scatter his ashes into the ocean. For the next 20 minutes, we drove back and forth over this bridge, trying to find a parking spot. My uncle lost his patience in both an angry yet humorous manner and proclaimed loudly, "If I have to drive over this bridge one more time, I'm going to wind down the window, say goodbye, Dad, and then throw him over the bridge." I burst into tears of laughter, knowing my grandfather would have laughed just as much at that comment. Story 54. At my grandfather's funeral last month. "You're the liberal granddaughter?" To my blonde cousin, "The rest of us have dark hair, what? How did you all get a cotton head?" People taking pictures of the presentation, which seems strange to me. "Haven't seen you in forever." I know your father hasn't either. I'm estranged from my father. When the chaplain was told to keep his reading short because he is known to be long-winded, he said, "I'll keep this brief, as specifically stated by name as daughter," completely throwing my mother under the bus. There is probably more, but that was the main stuff. Small town, small minds. Story 55. Not said, but still inappropriate. My husband's grandmother died last year. We went to her funeral. Keep in mind, this was at about 9 to 10 in the morning. A close friend of my mother-in-law showed up drunk. I could smell her breath from 5 meters away. She was stumbling and talking way too close to people's faces. When the part for the close family only came, she stayed and was the first to say a little prayer and touch the grandmother's urn. I found it absolutely hilarious, but not everyone agrees. Story 56. About 25 years ago, a woman I was working with lost her teenage daughter. She was hugging the ex-partner and started verbally attacking him, calling him offensive names. It turned out he became physically aroused while they were hugging over their deceased daughter. Story 57. At my mother-in-law's funeral, a woman slipped my father-in-law her phone number and said to call her anytime. It was gross. My in-laws had been married for over 50 years. Story 58. Funny story my mom told me. I think it was at my dad's oldest sister's funeral. One of the other siblings said, "Let's do this again soon," apparently referring to the remaining 6 siblings being together. My mom responded that it was not going to be at her funeral. Story 59. When I was a child, during the moment of silence, I loudly exclaimed, "Does anyone want to hear a joke?" In my defense, I did not understand what was happening and wanted to make everyone happy. Story 60. One thing I absolutely hated was the preaching at the funeral of my dad's uncle. The pastor had the audacity to go on and on about hell and how we end up there if we don't believe. The son of the deceased is a metalhead too. It felt like one of those underhanded Christian slights that religious people do, passive-aggressive. I wanted to punch that man badly. I might have if it had been my dad in that coffin. But I wasn't about to make that funeral about my feelings like that pastor was doing. Story 61. The widow, their children, spouses, and grandchildren all stood outside the funeral home and took a family picture. Almost everyone had big, happy smiles. The same family took a picture of the mother holding the urn of the deceased son, with the surviving siblings all together, smiling. Story 62. It was not said at the funeral, but it was a text someone received at a funeral. The woman thought laughing out loud means lots of love. She sent a text saying, "I heard your grandma died. Laughing out loud." Story 63. Not said, per se. My grandmother passed away in our home country, and as a courtesy to us who could not make the funeral, my uncle live streamed it so we could join the prayers and eulogy. Several cameras were running as if in a video call. What did I see in the corner? My cousin and her boyfriend making out and dry humping against a sidewall in the lobby. He was very clearly touching her inappropriately under her morning dress. Another cousin went into the lobby to blow her nose and caught them. She proceeded to take her shoe off and smack the boyfriend while cursing him loudly. Thanks, cousin. No wonder grandma hated your boyfriend. Story 64. My husband's grandfather was named Richard, and everyone called him Dick. The pastor began the eulogy with, "God loved Dick." Story 65. Not super inappropriate, but pretty hilarious. My great-grandma was 99 years old when she died. She loved homemaking and helping others and had made many dedicated friends over the years from all the people she helped. At her funeral, one of the women she had helped went to the open casket, weeping. The woman grabbed her hand and wailed, "You died too soon, Grandma J. Too soon. At age 99. Story 66. Not a funeral, but right after my best friend's mother died that day, I said something. We were 15 at the time. I had never dealt with death before. It was very stressful. Someone asked a casual question about how I was doing. I said, "Just living life." Immediate regret. Story 67. Someone who was asked to give the eulogy was too honest and said that the deceased was a loner and had no real friends. You do not have to roast him like that during his own funeral. Story 68. I have been told, "You need to calm down," just for crying. I do not make any noise because I am socially anxious. I do not even blow my nose. Story 69. A devout Christian man was eulogized by his eccentric sister, who revealed that he lived somewhat of a double life and used strong language. The strict religious crowd was mortified. Story 70. I was at a friend's funeral about 12 years ago. It was a difficult day because he was murdered by his girlfriend's ex. My friend who was killed was Hispanic. This took place in Texas, and the funeral home was packed with barely any standing room. The priest was giving his eulogy and began speaking about Mexican funerals in a lighthearted way, trying to lift the mood. My friend Raul, who is also Mexican and sitting next to me, leaned over and said without humor, "Don't these brown people know this is America? Damn it." I tried very hard not to laugh and almost felt sick. So, it was not horrible, but definitely sad. Story 71. It's the quietest he has ever been, said about my late husband. Sorry, my entire family has terrible morbid senses of humor. Story 72. I only came for the food, didn't even like her. My heart skipped a few beats. I thought my funeral was going to be next. Story 73. I attended my best friend's great-grandmother's funeral with her when we were around 18. Her grandmother, daughter-in-law of the deceased, pointed out an attractive cousin of the same age to her granddaughter in an attempted Cupid moment. After a moment of shock and disgust, she reminded her grandmother that they were cousins. Her grandmother replied, "Your mom is adopted. The kids won't be deformed or anything." Story 74. My mother-in-law showed up at my father-in-law's funeral after being divorced for 25 years to set the record straight about anything anyone said about him. I was absolutely astonished. Story 75. I was about 11 or 12 at my father's real father's funeral. Before the service, I was spending some quality time with my uncle, which was nice. For some reason, I decided to sing Another One Bites the Dust. But only so my uncle could hear. I think about it a lot. Story 76. This is a bit of a cultural thing. Funerals are loud and theatrical where I'm from. Burial happens the same day, so the funeral and wake have high emotions. Loud wailing and chest beating are pretty standard. However, when my grandfather died and mourners kept visiting for several days, I noticed my mom and aunts, the deceased's daughters and daughters-in-law, would switch from being normal to super dramatic and hamming it up. So I asked my mom and aunts why they were faking this grief, and they said, "People compare daughters and daughters-in-law. If they sense we aren't grieving as hard, they'll gossip that we are probably glad since we didn't care or that our husbands will get inheritance." Okay, maybe not the most inappropriate thing, but an oddly amusing thing to hear when you're 12. Story 77. My dad almost died last year but made it through. About 3 months later, his cousin passed away. At the funeral, my dad's mother looked at us and said, "Wow, I thought we were going to be here for Eric, not Steve." It seemed like she was relieved her nephew died instead of her son. She is a very cold person. Story 78. At my mother's funeral, my sister tried to give my son's mother information to use in court to take my son away from me. We share parenting. Of course, my son's mother told me about it. At the same funeral, my brother and his family took shots in the viewing area. Story 79. My cousin was about 5 or 6 years old. He walked up to the body, honked the deceased person's nose, and loudly exclaimed, "It feels like sausage," in front of everyone. Story 80. At my grandfather's funeral, a group of his friends took me aside. I was 16 years old. They started telling me the raunchiest stories and jokes. We were laughing so hard. It really helped with everything. Those men were awesome. Story 81. You girls need to pay for this. Referring to my sister and me, who were 21 and 23 at the time of our father's unexpected passing. Story 82. Not spoken but in action. The son of the deceased father, instead of accepting the sand offered by the funeral director, walked past her, went over to the pile of rubble, picked up a large piece of clay, and threw it full force at the coffin with the crowd watching. It was the most disturbing thing I have ever seen. The older brother held it together very well, though I saw his eyes turn blood red over the disrespect. The older brother is known to tolerate a fight or quarrel and surprised us all by letting it slide. They say in families there is always one, but I hope I never see anyone top that. Story 83. My cousin announced his engagement. Apparently, they were waiting until Grandpa improved and decided the funeral was the best place to do it, considering everyone was already gathered. They did not make a big deal of it, but still, wrong place, wrong time. Story 84. For crying out loud, how long did you want her to live? This was said by a cousin to another cousin who was inconsolable over his 98-year-old mother's death. Story 85. My grandfather died when my mother was about 14. At the funeral, when she and my grandmother were in the receiving line, a woman came up and explained that she had been having an affair with him for years, in front of his grieving wife and children. Story 86. Not inappropriate, but funny. My dad had an open casket at his wake. The great-grandchildren aged 8 and under were gathered at the coffin, having a very serious discussion. My 19-year-old niece went to talk to them. I asked what they talked about, thinking they were discussing life after death and other heavy topics. No, she said. They wanted to know if Grandpa had legs. Then they wanted to know if he had pants on. Story 87. My mother-in-law said, I bet this is the first time Carl, who has passed away, has ever been in a church. Story 88. My aunt passed away unexpectedly a few years ago. My uncle and stepfather are my grandparents' only children, and my uncle, who was married to my aunt, has always been the golden child and favored son. Therefore, my aunt was always favored over my mom. At my aunt's funeral, my grandfather looked at my mom and said, Well, Guess you're the only one left. Story 89. After a completely impromptu a cappella, off-key singing of a hymn in a style that can only be described as old lady warbling, the preacher stands up and says, "I just don't know what to say about that. I had to elbow Aunt Carol because she was laughing too loud." Story 90. My stepdad's ex-wife, who was married to my mom for 25 years, insisted on putting a large wedding photo of them on the board and stood up with immediate family. She was caught cheating by their son while my stepdad was visiting family. She turned her youngest son against my stepdad, making him testify in court that he was a bad father. They became estranged, even though my stepdad continued to try to maintain a relationship. He raised me and my 4 younger siblings, his 2 boys, and my little half-brother, all while working 50 hours a week. He was the best man I ever knew. 300 people showed up to the funeral because he was such a great person. His ex behaved badly and had the audacity to yell at my grieving mom when we politely asked her not to include the wedding photo. But photos of them as a family with her in them were welcome. At the same funeral, my mom's estranged sister showed up dressed all in white, wearing designer sunglasses, and clearly under the influence of medication. People can be wild. Story 91. When my ornery grandmother died, my uncle gave the eulogy. The first words he said were, "We all know Mom was a difficult woman. She was certainly difficult and sometimes unpleasant, but I was always one of her favorite grandsons." I took no offense at what he said. His words were true. Some family members took offense, but they were mostly those who had little contact with her in her later years. Story 92. Not exactly inappropriate, but I had a relative say, "I will be next." Everyone told him that was not true and advised him not to talk like that. Well, a few months later, story 93, I have been to 3 funerals in my life. The police were called to 2 of them. Yes, they were in West Virginia. Why do you ask? Story 94. "I'll have you after your husband's done with you," said to my parent by the husband of the deceased during her funeral. He couldn't even get through it without wanting something else. To make a long story short, they did end up together as well. Story 95. My grandfather had passed, and my aunt is in an interracial marriage. I am sitting about 10 rows away from the town's funeral director, an elderly man who knows everyone and attends every funeral. When my aunt walks by, he whispers, "That's the one married to that black man." Story 96. I have 2 male cousins. When one was giving a eulogy for my uncle, the other one started interrupting, and it turned into an argument about how unpleasant their father was. Story 97. Story time. People thought I was crazy calling out to the deceased to come back. My mother has a very unique old-timey name, similar to Gertrude, changed for anonymity. Mom was named after her aunt, and in the spirit of honoring the great women, I named my first daughter the same. When my great-aunt passed, I gathered my children. My oldest daughter must have been 8 or 10 at the time, and due to the weather, we were quite late to the funeral. The funeral was held in a non-denominational church. When you entered, there was a large foyer with a seating area, a kitchen and dining area to the left, and classrooms with play areas for kids to the right. The sanctuary was straight ahead, separated from the foyer by glass walls and doors. It was a modern church, so the sermon could be heard clearly through speakers throughout the building. Since we were very late, I set my kids up to play in one of the playrooms on the right. I sat on a bench near the hallway to the playrooms, facing the kitchen area that had a large open pass-through serving window. I could see and hear volunteers quietly preparing for the luncheon after the service. Before the service ended, my oldest daughter left the playroom, walked toward the kitchen, and then turned toward the outside doors. Instead of getting up to follow her, I decided to call out to her. 3 times I said, "Name of deceased, where are you going?" Since the service was loud, I had to raise my voice. The last time, I said quite loudly, "Name of deceased, where do you think you're going? You cannot leave this building. Come back here." At that moment, I realized all the ladies in the kitchen had stopped and were staring at me. Story 98. A coworker asked the widow if she wanted to sell her late husband's prized Chevrolet Camaro at the graveside. Story 99. I was at my uncle's funeral when he overdosed on fentanyl. And I heard my mom say under her breath, I wonder if he had any left at the house. I don't talk to my parents much. Story 100. The mother of my boyfriend told me it was because of my pregnancy that my mother passed away. She is an unpleasant person. Story 101. Not something that was said, but I was told my uncle consumed alcohol before attending my wedding. Story 102. A lady came up to me at my grandmother's funeral when I was a child and said, Your sister is crying. Why aren't you? Story 103. Not at the funeral, but I worked at a Subway once and someone came in. While I was making their sandwich, I asked what they planned for the day since it was nice out. He said, Going to my mom's funeral. My conditioned response was, Well, that sounds fun. Before I realized what he said, I apologized profusely and gave him a discount. Story 104. My friend, who had lost her mother, was sitting next to her father. The father leaned over and said, I can't believe she fitted in that. Referring to the urn. My friend just elbowed her dad. Story 105. I present to you John Cleese at Graham Chapman's funeral. Story 106. At my father's funeral, the pastor said it was time to accept Jesus in your heart. Otherwise, you would be condemned to hell. My boyfriend and his Jewish family were there. It was horrible. Story 107. Right before we lowered my 96-year-old grandmother's casket into the ground, the presiding deacon cheerfully told my mother that our family really put the fun in funeral. We were laughing, but it was still the most remarkable line I have ever heard for that kind of service. Story 108. The funeral director who handed me the bill for my father's funeral and asked when it would be paid while we were standing in the cemetery next to my father's open grave. I am very upset with that person. Story 109. So he died of coronavirus disease, yes? He looks around the room. We are the only ones wearing masks. Well, this looks like a super spreader event to me. Story 110. I saw an old teacher at a funeral for another teacher. He said, How have you been doing? Without thinking, I replied, Living. I wasn't even trying to brag. It just came out. It still keeps me up at night. To add context, I had just lost my mom the year before, so my response was in part to that. Story 111. Father-in-law's funeral. His nephew was a morbidly obese man. An elderly man came through the procession and said to him, I remember you. We used to haul you around in that little red wagon. Now we'd need a payloader to move you. My brother-in-law and I just lost it. I had to go to the restroom to stop laughing. Story 112. At my aunt's funeral, my future father-in-law and my uncle's girlfriend discussed the Mr. Hands video about 15 feet from the casket. Story 113. The political situation being discussed and the reason the person died from it. In 2021, I did not stay because it was neither the time nor the place for that garbage. Story 114. Once my parents came to pick me up from school, and they were smiling after Nana's funeral. Why would you smile after a funeral? Story 115. It was in November at my mother's funeral. Her best friend and my mother's boyfriend wished us a Merry Christmas. And I still don't understand why. At my uncle's funeral, the priest called him by another name 3 times. Just like, we are here to remember Joseph Robert. And my granddad had to correct him, saying it was Rob Joseph. Then he mixed up the age too and tried to bless him with the water for the coffin's benediction. He was hitting the coffin with the water container for some reason. But the best part was a phone ringing with the happiest music during the ceremony. Somehow all that would have made my uncle laugh. Story 116. When I was a child, my great-grandfather died. I was about 4 years old. My mother took me to the back of the room. He was a well-known and loved man, so the room was full. I asked very loudly, Mommy, what is in that big box up there? Story 117. Not me laughing at my late cousin's funeral at the age of 9 years old. The face kind of made me giggle, seeing that her face was pretty much closed shut. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.